Hello and welcome to a video that's a little bit personal for me. When I was a car upholsterer, self-employed, before I became a journalist and between working in various sports car manufacturers, I worked for a while as a salesman in a Peugeot dealership. And this was the time when Peugeot were at their height in terms of reputation for handling. They were never the biggest sellers. They were never the best quality, but they at that time they were the kings of the hot hatch. And still say to this day that the Peugeot 205 GTI was and still is, considering its time, the best hot hatch ever. And that car is incredibly important because Peugeot were on their knees. They had taken over Citroën in the 70s, and then towards the end of the 70s, they absorbed the Chrysler Europe group, and that included Simca. They absorbed the Roots group, which became in UK Talbot, and that experiment didn't work very well, and again hurt Peugeot quite badly. They needed a success, and with Pininfarina styling, their new small car, the 205, was at first accepted as a beauty, but not really a big seller until the GTI and the GTTI, or the T16, that arrived in World Rallying in Group B came along. But the GTI was that old recipe of a big engine in a light car, but in this particular case, the handling was unique. Its biggest rival for good handling was the Volkswagen Golf GTI 16 valve. Now, the Golf was a class up. It was a bigger car, and it was also very expensive, even for its class. The 205 wasn't perfect, but what it did have was steering that you could feel what was going on. It was very rich in deep torque because it was a big 2-litre 8-valve engine. Sorry, a 1.9, a 1.6, then a 1.9, 8-valve engine, pulling a very lightweight car. So there wasn't any turbo like there was on the Renault 5 Turbo, which is the Gallic competition. That had a lot of lag and a 1.3-litre engine, and was, if anything, a lighter construction than the 205, and even more flimsy feeling. The 205 was built for lightness, and therefore wouldn't necessarily want to be involved in an accident. It did have a rear end that if you braked mid-corner, you could unsettle the back end and end up in a hedge, but you'd have to be driving like a bit of a loony to get to that. And a lot of the people that did that were basically driving beyond their skill level, truth be told. The gear lever was a long throw, but it was still a slick change. And as I said, the steering communicated. It felt like it was dancing on its tiptoes. And that is the sign of a good handling car. It wasn't just mechanical grip. It had a dance to it. It felt eager. It felt on its toes. And it was an absolute delight to drive. I cannot emphasize. At the time, you had the Ford Fiesta XR2 with a naturally aspirated carburetor 1.6-litre engine that was lower geared because it just didn't have the oomph of the 120 brake horsepower Peugeot 205 GTI. It didn't have the oomph, it didn't have the balance, it didn't have... And the same with the Astra from Vauxhall. The Astra, basically the Mark II Astra that came a bit later than the 205. Again, it's supposed to be a size up, but it was sort of halfway between the 205 and the Escort that it was competing against. It had a wobbly shell on the Mark II that was based on the floor pan of the Mark One, and it wasn't very sophisticated. It just had a big engine. What the 205 had was a delicacy, a balance, and the only car that came anywhere near it was the Golf, as I said. And it's a very close thing between the two of them, and you wouldn't be wrong for saying some people the Golf is the winner of the competition. But for me, the impact, the styling, the delicacy, the balance, the speed that you could attack a B road in the 205 made it, in 1.6 or 1.9 litre, guys, the ultimate GTI. And although there have been faster cars, faster Peugeots, none has had that dance, that on its toes, beautiful synergy that makes you feel like you really are. The car is just a very short link between you and the road underneath. You could feel what was going on. And if you had any kind of talent, you could move quite quickly in a 205 GTI. And as I said, the ones that end up in the hedge were usually those that ran out of talent, realised they were going too quickly, unsettled the rear end, and ended up in a hedge. Did it have flaws? Oh, yes. Major flaw, the interior. Doesn't matter which Peugeot you bought at that time, you were looking at an interior that was the last thing that it's like they put all the money into the Pininfarina styling and all the money into the chassis. By the time they got into the interior, they were skint. The plastics were horrible, they were plasticky. The seats were very comfortable, but they were very softly sprung, very softly padded with very soft foam, and that included the bolsters at the side. So when you had an old Peugeot 205 GTI, you had worn bolsters, and the interior let the car down massively. Although the bright red carpet, or whatever colour you specified, and the piping did brighten it up, but the quality couldn't really match. The key to the success of this car was that original 1.6 litre engine, which a lot of people say is the sweet one of the range, and the 1.9 that followed. It never went up to 16 valves. It didn't need to be honest. The car was just a delight and very punchy, because that 8-valve head did give it that one beautiful thing that you get from an 8-valve. It had low down torque, and it didn't matter what gear you were in, it would pick up and it would fly, and it felt like the engine was bigger than it was because the car was so light. I can't really emphasize enough what a big deal the Peugeot 205 GTI was to drive in its day. And Ford fans will always say, oh, I always loved my Fiesta or whatever, but the best one was the 205. Moving up a size, you had the Peugeot 309. Strange name, jumping a few numbers, but this car was originally going to be the replacement for the Talbot Horizon. And then at the last minute, Peugeot changed their minds and they put a Peugeot nose on it. They tried to put a Peugeot rear end. They still had the flimsy Peugeot run out of money interior, but it still had that lightweight big engine chassis that the 205 had, with a longer wheelbase, and that solved the handling issues on the Limit, to be honest. But it lacked in terms of quality compared with the Golf, and it wasn't as beautiful as the 205. To drive, it was fantastic. It had the same 1.6 or 1.9 litre 8-valve engine as the 205, but as I said, it had the longer wheelbase and it had a delightful chassis. What it lacked ultimately was that little bit of quality. The interior was as flimsy, as cheap, as nasty as the 205. Let the whole thing down, because don't forget, you're going to spend all your time on the inside. But to drive, it was fantastic. It felt on its toes. It was another dancer like the 205, but it just lacked that little bit of stardust, that little bit of magic. And of course, there wasn't a 309 in World Rallying. It was a Group A car at best, compared with the 205 T16. And I suppose it lacked that fairy dust that sort of rubbed off on the 205. And the 205, let's face it, Peugeot did the right thing going to Pininfarina. The 205-esque nose on the 309 was the best aspect, but by the time you got to the rear end, it just didn't work, and sales probably reflected that. It was a good car. It was, even in its base form, it had a fantastic ride, but it just didn't have that little bit of magic, that little bit of that X factor that the 205 had, but a much more worthy car than people give it credit for. And in a back-to-back against the Golf and the Escort would be in the dust. Even the RS Cosworth, the RS Turbo Escort, Mark III Escort, just couldn't. I've shown it a few corners and the 309 would lose it. Okay, the Astra had a more powerful engine in a straight line. Again, show it some corners, the Peugeot would leave it for dead. The Golf would be going toe-to-toe with the Peugeot. But what the Golf had was, if anything, slightly better styling, certainly as a whole. And it also had the build quality, and that interior was just built from granite compared with the very cheap, very nasty Peugeot effort. So that really is the main reason why the 309 isn't regarded as highly. A lot of those criticisms were answered with the replacement for the 309, the Peugeot 306 GTI, and in its best form was the Rally, which is the lightweight, lightened down version, and the GTI 6, which benefited from a rarity at that time of a 6-speed gearbox. Again, it had the balance of the 309, but it also matched that with a much better build quality, a much better interior, still a bit on the cheap and nasty side compared with a Ford or a Volkswagen, but it was a much more rounded car. It was a much more attractive car. It still had that delicacy of balance that Peugeots had become famous for through the 205, and it was a very good car in its class, and it was well regarded by the press. What it did have was a passive rear steer system, and I remember Patrick Watts, who was a Peugeot touring car driver at the time, telling me that he hated the 306 because, let's face it, he had a lot more driving talent than I ever had and pushed a car harder than I ever had. And he told me that on a track day, he used a 306, and the passive rear steer wouldn't communicate with him. It would suddenly do something, and he just didn't trust it. He didn't have that feel that he could push the car as far as he possibly could, and that the car wouldn't do something. It just felt like there was something that wasn't, it was going to do on its own. Driven on the road by someone At normal speeds, the 306 GTI 6 was possibly the best you could get at the time. For me, it wasn't the fastest, but if you were going down your favourite A road, your favourite B road, it was an absolute joy. And it was probably the last Peugeot in its class that could do that. The replacement for the 306 used the same floor pan as the 306, but it went taller. It became the 307. It was bloated. It was dull. It lost all the handling finesse. How they managed to mess it up quite so much, I really don't know. But it just wasn't the car that the 306 was. And this was sadly the beginning of the end of Peugeot as the king of the GTI. I mean, Renault were snapping at the heels, first of all with the Clio Williams in the 205 era, and then the various versions of the Clio that followed, and then the Megane. But Peugeot had been the kings, and it was like seeing the crown fall. I don't know what kind of decisions. They sold more cars, but they weren't as much fun to drive, and they just didn't appeal to the same base that they had in the 80s and early 90s. But the 306 may have been the beginning of the end, but it wasn't the end of the story, because there was one last hurrah for Peugeot. That car was the 406 Coupe. Now, the 406 Saloon was the replacement for the 405, which was the first Sierra class car that Peugeot produced that handled like the lower Peugeots. It was a good car, and it was a beautiful car with Pininfarina styling. Peugeot lost the rag with Pininfarina because the biggest car, the 605, had styling that was very similar to an Alfa. And the last car that Peugeot had styled by Pininfarina was the 406 Coupe. And what a car. It was beautiful. It had styling that looked like it'd come from Ferrari. It had a 2-litre engine or a 3-litre V6. The 2-litre was probably the best handling of the two, and the 3-litre just gave it just an air of luxury, and a leather interior, electric seats, and various other special features that came with the bigger engine. I was lucky enough to drive both, because by now I was working for Granada TV making programs for Men and Motors, and I did a feature with Richard Hammond on the 406 Coupe, and I remember we both loved the car. It was fantastic. We had a bit of an argument over who was going to take it home, and he ended up taking the Toyota Celica that we were pitching against it. But for me, the 406 Coupe had all the beauty of the 205. It had better build quality than the 205. I put my money on it being a nailed-on future classic. And sadly, people haven't really taken to it because of the badge in the same way that other cars of that era. Also, it gained a bit of a reputation for electrical issues, although I've never personally experienced any with it. And I must admit, if someone offered me one that was in decent condition now, this is the one I'd probably go for. It was a beautiful car. It drove beautifully. It handled nicely. It was something very, very special feeling. And after this, the car that replaced it, the 407 Coupe, may have been dynamically better. I don't know, I never got to drive one, but it never looked as good and it didn't sell as well. And that was when Peugeot, this was the last hurrah, the last gasp of Peugeot as an enthusiast's car before they went down the road of being, well, a little bit dull, a little bit boring. The handling just went out the window with a lot of their cars, and they only really got that back with the RCZ and the later 208. But in between, Peugeot were disappointing. The 206 GTI, there just nothing worked as well as those cars from the 80s. And that was the period for me when Peugeot really were the kings of the road. I hope you enjoyed this little video and my little trip down memory lane. And I hope you're enjoying the channel. If you go back through the archives, you'll find loads of videos. The entire series of the Alternative Car Show. There's also some motorsport programs, some rallying programs. You'll find something for everybody, including supercar kits and various other things. Please do go through the channel and check out our other videos. Whilst you're here, why not give us a thumbs up and click on the bell? And if you'd be so kind, tell your friends about the channel. And if you subscribe, obviously you will find out when other videos are due to drop. And we have some really nice videos coming down the line. So thank you again for watching. Take good care of yourself and do stick around and check out some of the other videos on the channel. We really are pleased that you found us and hope that you enjoy what you find here. Toodle pip.